Okay, welcome back to the Docova channel. In this video, we're going to talk about Picklist buttons. Picklist buttons? That's right, Picklist buttons. Let's go. Okay, so, a real strength of Docova is that we here at Docova, our developers, have developed custom applications for customers for decades. And so we have a lot of knowledge around what goes into making a real world application. So it's not just enough to have fields that you can drag and drop onto a form and stuff like that. It's the way the whole thing is put together and the type of things that you run into. And so as we go through these videos on YouTube, I think you can see how we have not just text, but computed for display and computed when composed and, computed fields and masked fields and so on. The things that you really end up needing, everybody has the cute demonstration, but when you really get down to developing an application that has to go into production, there can be a lot of nitty-gritty things that go into it. And so we try in Docova to make sure that we have the constructs that really make a difference. And this video is an example of one of those constructs, the Picklist button. Now, we call it a Picklist button because typically it's a couple of elements that work together. A certain Picklist button, an embedded view, and you can add in some specialized fields, and I'll show you. And you'll see the utility of this very quickly. Okay, so, and just to say that Picklist means you're picking from a list. For example, and I'm going to show you the example that I have here, picking expenses to put together an expense report, or picking from inventory items to put together an invoice. And so those are kind of examples of where you have to pick and pull information together and relate that information automatically and do something meaningful with it. However, there are different, construct subtleties about these pick lists, and that's what I'm going to go into first. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to this little PowerPoint slide that I have, just so I can explain this concept a little bit more. And let me shrink my head down here. All right. So for Picklist buttons, on the left-hand side of this slide is what we call assigning or moving. And on the right-hand side is what we call duplicating or copying. And the example for the assigning or moving is the expense example that I mentioned earlier. So in an expense application, we're going to have a look at the Docova store expense application really quickly, just to lend a little bit more context, because I'm going to show demo information here. And for those of you who need something a little bit more solid that you need to touch, if you're not getting the demo quite, then it's a more concrete display. Okay, so on the left-hand side, the concept of expense applications is that you collect expenses together, where the expense was from, what type of expense is it, how much is the expense, is it mileage and stuff like that. And then you have this list of expenses. Then you have to gather up some of those expenses for the month or for a project, for example, or for a business meeting or, a business trip or something like that. And you got to put those expenses together onto an expense report. And then that expense report, for example, goes through some sort of workflow to get approved, right? And then it goes on to somebody else. They authorize a payment and you get paid for your expense report. So the key thing there is that when you have expenses and they go onto your expense report, that's one thing. That's one expense item that is attached to an expense report. That's one-to-one, and you don't use that expense anywhere else as a document. It is just attached to that expense report. The copy scenario is like inventory and invoice. Creating invoices. So imagine you have an inventory of products where you have the product number or item number. You have a description, you have an amount in terms of how much that inventory item costs, and then you typically have how much of that item that you have in inventory. So that you have 5 cars or you have 5 widgets or whatever it is. But when you create an invoice, then you need to go and pick from your inventory and put that item information onto your invoice. And then you need to detract the amount you're putting on your invoice from your inventory. So if you have 10 hats and you add 5 hats to your invoice, you got to take 5 hats out of your inventory, right? Everybody knows how to do that. And so the question is, how do you do that easily? How is it that we can put these kind of constructs together? And they're used over and over in applications in terms of relating information together, grabbing information from one place to the other. We've worked in all kinds of industries, from construction to the medical industry to you name an industry, and we've developed custom applications in that industry. And there's all kinds of different ways that this construct or these constructs can be used. And so we call it Picklist buttons. So let's go and have a look at it. As usual, to our element demos application. So I'm going to open this up. I'm going to go down to the form elements, because this is a form element that you put onto a form. And we're going to go to the Picklist item. And as per the slide there, we have assign and duplicate. Okay. So when assigning something, I'm just going to open up the existing document that we have there, because it has a few things assigned to it already. And of course, this is the idea of the expense report and expenses. Now, if we roll down on the left-hand side here, you'll see that we have, if I go all the way down, test data. And so if we go down to the test data here, you can see that we have inventory items right here. So this just acts as inventory items. These inventory items can even be in a different system, and because DocOva can look up to other places, or can share information with other systems. But if you have an inventory application in DocOva that's holding your inventory, you can get it from there. Just to show you that when I show the duplicate or inventory, this is example, this is where it's getting the data from. So we've created inventory items, just as the demonstration here. And then see down here we have expense examples, unassigned and assigned. So for the expense example that I'm about to show you, just in the element demos application, you'll see that I have 2 expenses that are unassigned to a so-called expense report, for example. And then these ones here are assigned. Okay, so the point being that when you, the example with the inventory was when you have an invoice and you add something from inventory and you say, I have 5 of the hats from the 10 that you have in inventory, you have to subtract those 5 from the 10 in inventory. And with expenses, when an expense is added to an expense report, you want to say that that expense has been assigned to the expense report. The reason why is because when you make another expense report, you don't want to be able to see all the other, you want to be able to see only expenses that are unassigned to an expense report so far. That's how you would track what hasn't been expensed yet, and so on, right? So for the expenses, you have to change a status on the expense item. And that status, if you look in the 3rd column of this view here, is basically assigned or unassigned. So as we assign an expense item to an expense report, we have to set a field on the expense item to say that it's assigned. Okay, so that's just to show you that, in both cases, whether you're just getting information from inventory, you're not assigning that whole inventory record. You're just assigning information about that inventory record to an invoice, versus an expense report where you're actually moving, or you're actually taking that record and assigning it. It's not available for anything else. It's just one expense to one expense report. Okay, hopefully that's not too confusing. Okay, so let's go to this expense example, or the move example. And you can see that I've assigned a few things here. So when I click select expenses, I'm saying on that button, go to the unassigned expense view, which we just looked at. It just had 2 items in it. And this is where you can select. This is where you'll see your unassigned expenses, and you can select one and say OK, and it will add it to this list down here. Now this list is just an embedded view, But what we're doing is we're saying when we assign an expense to this expense report, make it a child document. So they're related, so that the expense report is the parent document and the expense becomes a child. So they're actually related in the background together with a key. Okay, and they show up here. Also want to draw your attention to this field in the bottom right here. This bottom right field is actually a total, and it's a special field where I can say, put the field on here, and by the way, I want to get the total from an embedded view on this form from a column. And so it will sum or average or whatever that particular, and I'll go over that too in a second. Okay, so that's the sort of move example. And then this example is more like the invoice inventory example, where this has inventory items, and I say pick inventory item, but this button again is a pick list button, and it's showing me a view, and that view is showing me inventory, and I can pick one or several inventory items, and when I click OK, it gets added to the invoice, for example. If you can think of this, it's just a demonstration, but it's think of this as an invoice, for example. Okay, and so that's a key difference between sort of moving documents and copying information from documents. Okay, and I hope you understand. I hope I'm clear on what that difference is. Okay, so let's go and have a look at the pick list examples in the design. And then we'll go look at an inventory application that's hopefully show it a little bit more. Okay, forms. Let's go look at pick list. Okay, assign. I'll probably want to go over here. So this is the assign scenario. You can see here I have an embedded view, and that's where we're going to view the records that we assign to this expense report that we've called it. And in the field name for this embedded view, we're just leaving it at section_2. That's the ID of this, and I'll show you why that's important later. But if I click on this select expenses button, so this is, so before I do that, let me go to the form elements here. And you'll see that we did a video on buttons, and then you can see this pick list button is a special, it's its own element that you drag and drop onto the form. So this isn't just a button, this is a pick list button with special properties. So when I click on this pick list button, you show, select expenses because that's going to be the action of it. And then you'll see here that I have a window title called Select Expenses and a prompt message called Select Expenses for this report. And just to show you where that is, if I go back to the assign one and I open up and edit this so-called expense report. So here's the Select Expenses button, and when I click on it, at the top of this dialog, there's Select Expenses as the title of the dialog, and then it says Select Expenses for this report, right, as the prompt on this dialog at the very top here. Okay, so that's where these two properties come in. So you tell it what you want the dialog to say to the user. And then the source of the expenses. Now, I showed you the unassigned and the assigned expenses. So we want to show the unassigned expenses, expenses that have not been assigned to an expense report yet. And so that's the name of this view. And so when we open up that dialog, we're saying this is the view column of information that we want. And the refresh embedded view is section 2. So just as I showed you a second ago, the ID of the embedded view here is section_2, and so that's what we're going to pick here. Now, this button you can pick. If I had multiple embedded views, then I would see all of their IDs here, and I can say, this pick list button is associated with this embedded view, so it knows when to refresh things. Whenever you pick stuff, Docova knows and has built the code around saying, oh, you pick something with this pick list, you want to associate it or show it through that embedded view, and so it will refresh it for you. The selection action here is assign or duplicate, right? So we said assignment, which is a move, because in this case we want to move the document. The concept is moving the document, one expense for one expense report. And so we say assignment move, and that's the type of pick list button that this is. And then down here is really interesting in that now I'm saying, you know what, on that target expense that I've got, that expense item, there's a field called expense status. Remember I was talking about the status has to change from unassigned to a report to assigned to a report, right? So here we can just put in the field and say, there's a field on that form called expense status, and I want to change it to assigned, right? And so that means when it is assigned, Docova will take care of changing that field over there to be assigned. And you can have several, so you can put in several. You can see that I could add more fields here, so you could set a whole bunch of things on that other document over there, and it gets assigned. And so not only does it get assigned, but it also becomes a child. I was mentioning earlier that the ID of the parent report, expense report, is actually associated with the child or with the expense, so that they become children to the parent. Now, when we go through views, we'll talk more about parent and children or parent and response documents, because there's a whole hierarchy of threaded documents that you can have for discussions or for policies and procedures, or there's a whole bunch of them, a whole bunch of scenarios where that comes up, but just suffice it to say right now that expenses become children to the expense report that they're a part of. Okay, and then let's go over to the duplicate one. I'm going to click on the pick list button again, and you can see here now, I'm just going to jump right down. Notice the source view is the inventory items in this particular case, and the example here, or the demonstration here, is that this would be an invoice, for example, in the duplicate example, and we're going to pick up inventory items. And the depiction here is that we're getting information from those records. We're not assigning those records to this document like we did with the expense report. Instead, we're using information off of those documents to put onto this, or to make a copy, so that we're saying, you know, grab some inventory information out of the inventory view, but I'm going to create my own inventory records on this invoice, right? Invoice items. And so in this particular case, since we're saying duplicate or copy, you can see here that we have a target form, and that is what that new record is going to be called, or what that new document is going to be called. So it's an invoice item, and that invoice item is going to be assigned to this invoice. So it's not just text in a grid on your invoice. It's actual records that are created and associated with the invoice, so that you can manipulate that information further down the line to do more sophisticated things or complex things. But suffice it to say, it's not like a spreadsheet. It's not like you have a table and you've put inventory information into that table. These are actual records that are physically outside, but to the user, it's an invoice with invoice items. And here, sort of similarly to the assigned functionality, we are saying for the new record that gets created for that new invoice item, what the item code is, what the cost is, the description, the quantity, and stuff like that. And all that is created here, so that when you automatically create that document by using a pick list button, that you can automatically create that stuff. And then again, there's the total here. Okay, fine. Enough time. Let's go and have a look at a more concrete example, because I know these are demonstrations in the Element Demos database, and kind of the problem with that is, some developers will get it typically because they understand the depictions, but sometimes it's easier to see something more concrete. So let's go into this. So this is an expense tracker. We're going to do a deeper dive into the expense tracker application. This is just a simple expense tracker that also has a mobile component where you can gather together expenses, whether it's mileage or taking a photo with your phone of a receipt from lunch, for example, or whatever it is. And it has some reporting, and it has an example of creating an expense report and associating your expenses onto that report. So you know what, let's go and create a new one. But I'm going to navigate around in this expense app a little bit just to show you. So here it's all collapsible. And if I go to my expenses, these are just expenses that are my expenses. And typically in this application, 10 people can use this application, but you'll only see your expenses. And you'll only see your expense reports, or your boss or your boss's boss or whatever will see the expense reports because they have to approve them. And I'll just go through this a little bit. So in this particular case, you can see I have expenses here, and they're categorized into reported expenses. So I'm going to expand that. So these ones are already on report somewhere, and unreported expenses. So me as a user of this expense application, I still have these expenses that I need to put an expense report together and submit for approval. Right now I can look at these expenses by project, by type, for example, so meals or other taxis or hardware. I can look at them by month, when they were entered, November, October, January, whatever it is, right? So this is just depictions, views of my expenses. I could total the amount column here. I can, and our totals follow all the categorization that you might put into a view. Again, in our views, we'll go over that in more detail, but you could see, I'd be able to easily see how much unreported expenses I have that I need to put onto expense reports. So now my expense reports. So here I have expense reports by description. So these are expenses for January, or by status, and that would be approved or submitted, not submitted, that sort of thing, by month, waiting approval, that sort of thing, okay? So let's just go to by description, and I'm going to create a new one. And so here I'm just going to say November, click on it, November expenses. And this is just demo. This isn't real information or whatever, but we'll say it is. And here I'm just going to fill in a user, one of the users here that's in the .gov application. So Chris here is actually the director of implementation and support. And so I'm just going to add him to the form just for the heck of it. And then now I have a couple of buttons here. And this add expense button is a Picklist button. And if I click on it, it's telling me I got to save my report before it can start adding things to it. And I'm going to say, yeah, okay. Just a warning, you don't have to show that if you don't want as a developer, but I chose to. So here is that view again that we saw before of expenses, right? And this is expenses by project. And so it's saying, expense, pick some expenses that are going to go on this expense report. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to say, oh, this one was a meal, and this other one, and I'll say this hardware here. And then I'm going to click OK. Okay, so you'll see that what it's done is it's taken those expenses that I selected and it's associated them with this expense report. So it has assigned those expenses to this expense report and actually made them a parent-child relationship as well, which I would be able to do other things with in my application. And you can see here that it's automatically totaled, so that special field that I showed you where you can say, hey, look at an embedded view and total up that column. So what I said here was total up the amount column here and show it here. And this down below is just workflow. So we'll go through in a subsequent video how you can build workflow for your applications, and really easy, and drag and drop the logic of how your workflow processes will go. But suffice it to say that this is in the start mode. So I'm creating my expense report, and when I'm ready, I can, up here you'll see a button called submit expense report. And what that will do is it will submit this report to Chris Fales, who will approve it or decline it or what have you, right? And so I'm just going to save this right now because it's just a demo, but this is an example showing you of how much stuff is being expensed, or how the Picklist assign button, Picklist button is being used. Okay, so save and close. So now I have these expenses, and over here too, this just shows some of the charts and counters that you can do. I haven't sent any of these expenses in to be approved yet, so that's why there's 0 across here, is because it just isn't hitting the radar on those yet. This is just a demo application. But now you can see, I can see my reported. So these are the new ones that I added on here just now. So these are now being reported, say, with respect to me, and so on. So that's just an example of how the Picklist button is being used. It's really easy to drag and drop an embedded view, say what the embedded view is to depict, and then use the Picklist to pick from a list somewhere to add to this. I think that's all I want to say right now about Picklist buttons. Again, when we go through some of the applications, like the expense application, we'll probably touch on this topic again. So thank you for joining me for this video. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Questions or comments below, and hit that like button because it helps the algorithm, helps us get pushed out there more. Okay. So thanks for now, and see you on the next one.